Associate. I want to thank you for joining us on today's webinar entitled Expanding Educational Opportunities and Improving Life Outcomes for Foster Youth Nationwide. This webinar is co-hosted by Education Law Center, Juvenile Law Center, and the American Bar Association Center on Children and the Law. Before I move forward in the spiel I'm about to give, I just want to check everybody's audio connection. If you could please use the chat box to let me know if you can hear me or not. Okay. Looks like you can hear me. If you have any audio problems during the webinar, please use that chat box to let me know, and I will troubleshoot with you. Today's panelists include Kathleen McNaught, Assistant Director of the ABA Center on Children and the Law, and Maura McInerney, Senior Staff Attorney at Education Law Center. Before we get started, I just want to run through some technical issues. If you're participating by phone today, your line will be muted during the entire webinar. If you have any questions during the webinar, you can type those into the questions box that appears in your GoToWebinar control panel, and this includes any technical issues that you may be experiencing. There's a little orange arrow at the top of the rectangle which you can click to expand and collapse the control panel. We'll try to save some time today at the end of the webinar to answer your questions. Please note that this webinar is being recorded, and if you would like access to any webinar materials, please contact Barbara Langford. And now I'd like to turn it over to today's moderator, Bob Schwartz, Juvenile Law Center's Executive Director.
Okay, thank you, Chelsea, and greetings from Philadelphia, where the worst blizzard in the history of the city dropped almost an inch of snow overnight. So I hope you're in better shape where you are. Today's webinar is very exciting for us. We three organizations, Education Law Center, the ABA Center on Children and the Law, and Juvenile Law Center, sort of came together about 10 years ago at a convening we held at Chapin Hall to discuss the problems of education and foster youth. We began working together and 2 years later created this informal legal center for foster care and education, which is sponsoring today's webinar. We will be going through a number of issues. First, Maura, Kathy, Maura, and then time for questions. We will first be going over the link between child well-being and education, something that you well know, but connected to our project work. Outline our strategy, our theories of change, the key issues and approaches with examples of the federal activities, the state technical assistance, including some work we're doing in Texas to demonstrate our approaches, hit on some of the lessons we've learned over the last 8 to 10 years in working in this issue around the country, and opportunities that might be of interest to you to explore as we move forward, and to provide more information about our project activities and goals for the future and how to learn a little bit more about our work. So I'm going to turn it over to Maura on this next phase, and I'll be moving the slides as we go through. As Chelsea suggested, if you have questions, please put them in the chat box, and we'll get to them at the end of the webinar. Maura?
Thanks very much, Bob. This is Maura McInerney from the Education Law Center. As Bob mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit today about the connection between education and well-being. And before I launch into the specific education barriers faced by children in foster care, I wanted to spend a moment to underscore two important components. One is that well-being is often an overlooked factor with respect to children in the foster care system. Very often we're focused on safety and permanency. That's where courts are focused. That's where child welfare agencies are focused. And often, as this group knows very, very well, well-being is often overlooked. In addition to that, education is also a key component of well-being, and yet education is often overlooked as well. it's important to underscore that under our theory of change, it isn't just that education is important with respect to academic outcomes and life outcomes of children. Rather, it's important to recognize that it cultivates social and emotional well-being. It's where the child spends the majority of their time. It's an opportunity in schools to cultivate and develop social and emotional skills. It's very, very critical as a component of physical well-being, of health, and all of that. So I think it's important to really recognize at first where education fits within the framework of well-being. With that in mind, I'd like to turn to the specific education barriers that are faced by children in foster care. The first is well known to everyone, I'm sure, and that's the lack of placement stability leading to school instability. So we have children who on average change placements 2.8 times the first year they're in foster care. By the time they are 17 or 18 years old, majority of children have changed placements 5 times or more. So as part of that placement instability, we see the outcomes in the school context. We see delays in enrollment. There have been studies that have disclosed that children often miss 2 weeks of school every time they change placements and change schools. We also see that a number of children are absent. On average, children miss 25 days of school when they're in foster care. That's according to a recent CHOP Policy Lab study. And we've also seen that among children, older youth, particularly in the group home context, 3/4 of those children are often delayed in enrolling in school, missing over 2 weeks of school. This is compounded often by a history of truancy that the children in foster care may come in with. So it's no surprise to anyone that there are problems with respect to credit transfer issues. In the state of Pennsylvania, for example, we have 500 different school districts with 500 different school district graduation requirements. So often children are not able to graduate from school at all because they didn't take that 9th grade civics course, etc. This has led to low graduation rates, and on average, only 50% of 18-year-olds will complete high school. Graduation rates are far lower than other student cohorts. We also see a number of children, 40% of whom may have special education needs, and in many instances they are not identified or children fail to receive appropriate services. This is really a critical factor undermining school success because often those children don't have a parent in that very parent-driven special education process. So that's a key problem for children. Especially we have to recognize that often caregivers may not know the child or the child may be unknown to the school. Again, we're not identifying what that child really needs in the special education context. We also see, very sadly, disproportionate rates of suspension and expulsion among children in foster care. They are 2 times more likely to be suspended and 3 times more likely to be expelled. We also see overrepresentation of children in the dependency system in alternative education programs. We have a number of children who are in congregate care settings where they may be in residential placements attending inferior on-site educational programs. All of these factors undermine education success. I urge you to look at the National Working Group on Foster Care and Education's national fact sheet that encapsulates all of this data, that reflects the fact that children are really failing academically. They're at great educational risk. So I urge you to look at that. By way of example, a recent California statewide study, that California is a state that's really, really focused on children in the foster care system on a statewide level. What they found is that children in foster care are even more educationally at risk than other low socioeconomic status peers. But they compare them to children who are English language learners, special education students, children of poverty, and they found that children in the foster care system were more likely than the general student population to attend low-performing schools, also to be enrolled in non-traditional schools, alternative schools, etc. And they're nearly 4 times more likely to attend a non-traditional school than both low SES and general student populations. This underscores the fact that what we've seen in other regional studies, we don't have a lot of national data on this, but we do rely on regional and local studies that underscore the fact that they're twice as more likely to repeat a grade. The average reading level of 17 to 18-year-olds is 7th grade. So all of that we see at the state level when we look at that data. Next slide. So just to take a step back, as we look at these abysmal outcomes, we need to look at what would the theory of change be. So I want to share with you our theory of change, and that is three real components. The first is that we ensure that we are working at all levels, at the federal, state, and local level, and that one is informing the other. As we learn lessons about what works, about what important interventions are critical for children, that those are informing the state and the federal policy and law. Number two, that we need to work across all systems. Courts, child welfare, and education are all equal players in this. They have different obligations and have a different lens through which they look at this student population. We need to understand that they need to work synergistically in order to address this issue. And number three, that change needs to be data-driven, that we're looking at sharing information across systems between child welfare and education, that we're learning what interventions are successful, that we're learning what children really need. And the fourth, to ensure that we're supporting changes in law and policy that will make an impact for these children. And now I'm going to turn it over to Kathy.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Maura and Bob and Chelsea, for your assistance, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. So I'm going to take over and talk a little bit about a resource that we created. As Bob mentioned, our three organizations came together in 2007 to form the Legal Center on Foster Care and Education. And one of the first activities we undertook was creating a common framework, a common vision of what youth in care needed to be educationally successful. And we each as individual organizations have been focused on that issue. There were other national organizations looking at this, and we really spent a lot of time identifying what the 8 leading goals we'd like to see if a young person in care could achieve educational success. We also identified under each one of those goals benchmarks. So indicators that that if these things could be achieved, we would be far greater likelihood to see educational success for young people. And that framework is youth-driven. It's written specifically in language that talks about what youth need, and it really is a tool that we see as being really critical to use in multiple ways. One, to really help systems in their reform efforts. So use it as a tool to say, if these are the goals we want to see for young people, how can we as systems work collaboratively to ensure that happens? It can also be in folks' advocacy efforts, in their direct case advocacy, and in their local and state level advocacy. And it really is a tool for all stakeholders. So let's take a look on the next slide. You'll see what those 8 goals are, and this really is critical for our framework. So as many of you who are familiar with our framework and have thought about education-related issues for kids in care know that goals 1 and 2 have certainly been a focus of attention of the last several years. Goal 1 being ensuring that children are remaining in their same schools even when there's changes to their living placements, so really addressing that barrier that Maura pointed out to us, and that when changes are necessary, when it's best for kids to have changes, Goal 2 talks about those seamless transitions whenever a school needs to change. Goal 3 focuses us on making sure we include, when we think of the full scope of educational success, our youngest children, our youngest learners, that young children between the ages of birth and 5 are really given the supports and interventions needed to enter school ready to learn. But I feel like the rest of the goals of our blueprint, which we've been focused on, but really bear some more attention, and I think might resonate with some of you who are members of the Youth Transition Funders Group. Goal 4 really talks about equal access to the full school experience. So here we're really talking about even when we're able to stabilize a child in school, all of the additional efforts that need to be put in place so that that child can be successful. So whether that's supportive services, tutoring, if a child has special education needs, what additional individualized supports need to be put in place. This goal talks about academic supports, but it also touches on another equally critical piece to the school experience, and those are those extracurricular activities that keep kids engaged and excited about going to school and learning. And so it's really talking about what additional supports all systems can provide to ensure that children's full school experience is realized. Goal 5 is another very critical goal, and talking about some of the most common barriers, again, that Maura has already mentioned, that keep kids out of school. So addressing dropout issues, truancy, and disciplinary issues, and to really make sure that youth in care, that we change the trajectory of the data that we're seeing, which is that youth are far higher represented with those outcomes and being pushed out of school. And then goal 6 is important because it focuses us on ensuring that youth are involved and empowered in all of their education programming and planning. So setting the goals that they have for their education, being involved in those meetings about what's working, what's not working in their current education setting and education program, and really empowering them to be the voice of change. Goal 7 focuses on the adults that young people need. We all know that for ultimate success, our older youth in care really need supportive adults. We talk about at a minimum one adult that's going to see them through adulthood. From an education context, we talk about that with at least one adult who really understands how to help them navigate their education, the education systems themselves, and to achieve the goals that they have for their education and their futures. And then finally, having young people enter into and complete whatever post-secondary education goals they might have. If you go to the next slide, I wanted to just call folks' attention. We spent a little time looking at sort of the makeup of the Youth Transition Funders Group and realized that you are organized around 3 major work groups. And I just thought it was interesting to think about this blueprint framework in light of the different work groups that you have laid out. Obviously, your foster care work group, this is a foster youth-driven framework, and so it's certainly very relevant. Your multiple pathways to graduation work group, folks, I think probably have the work and the focus we've done around Goal 5, in particular, the dropout, truancy, and discipline areas, and what interventions can be put in place to ensure that young people in care, remain in school and have a successful school experience. But certainly the pieces of Goal 4, where we talked about the supports, and the pieces of Goal 8, ensuring that young people are entering post-secondary with all the skills they need to be successful and complete post-secondary and to be successful ultimately in their ultimate employment, all really resonate with the multiple pathways focus of your work group. And finally, I know you also have a youth justice work group, and while certainly we know that young people in the juvenile justice system share a lot of the barriers that Maura outlined are common between juvenile justice and child welfare youth, that we in our work have really focused on young people in care who also cross over into the juvenile justice system and what that added layer means for their educational success. But we also wanted this group to know that we're getting ready to launch some expanded work and expanded focus on juvenile justice education issues specifically, so just be on the lookout for that. The other framework I took a look at, and I think is important for our conversation, is the framework for well-being for older youth that I had found on your website that came out, I think, in 2013, focusing on a plan for investing in social, emotional, physical well-being of older youth in foster care, and sort of looking at the domains that are highlighted in that framework. And it really struck me in doing sort of a crosswalk of these 2 frameworks, how aligned they are and how complementary they can be in terms of some of the things that we are looking at. In the intellectual potential as an example in that domain, really thinking about, there's language in that framework talking about exposing youth to stimulating learning environments, participating in opportunities that spark interest, that really are resonating with some of what I just described. Certainly in the social, emotional, social development domain, your framework points out engaging in positive social behaviors, communicating effectively, and I think that really resonates when we talk about, Goal 5 and behavior issues that are keeping kids out of school, and then ultimately empowering young people to be active participants in their education planning, I think is really critical. And finally, the mental wellness and the physical health domains in that framework really resonated with me, both in terms of the piece of our blueprint that focuses on ensuring kids are getting the right unique supports and services, whether that's general education or for those young people where that where their mental health or physical health issues rise to the level of needing special education services, and really supporting that piece. So those are just some of the examples I think I wanted to highlight for you related to and thinking about these different frameworks that exist out there and how the interplay really works well together. Go to the next slide. So I wanted to, as Maura pointed out, we have this theory of change, and we have focusing on working on multi-levels. And I think it might be really helpful for us to take a couple of steps back and just see how this blueprint framework and this theory of change plays out on a couple of these different levels that we talk about, both at the federal and state level. So first we've outlined over the next 3 slides some highlights, some federal policy highlights over the years. And obviously, a lot of this began around the time of our project creation, but it began in 2008 with when Fostering Connections to Success Increasing Adoptions Act passed, with really the first meaningful language addressing education for us to see in child welfare federal law. And I think that really has catapulted us over time. We've seen real steady progress and in real, I would call it a growing momentum at the federal level, as these points on this timeline can really show. Growing momentum to really think about foster care and education issues and highlight that. On that second slide in this, it's sort of a 3-part visual here. The passage of the Unelected Scholars Act in early 2013 was really critical in that it was the first significant education law change to really solidly help address and alleviate some barriers that were being experienced by child welfare professionals in accessing educational records and information. And that certainly was a critical part of our focus and work during that time. And also just wanted to point out, about a year ago, a very successful Hill briefing that we were able to coordinate with a national working group on foster care and education to really increase the knowledge and awareness on the Hill about foster care and education issues and how critical those are. If you look at the last slide on that visual, I think where, as we said, we've had really increased momentum, and as we look to the future, we see that it is continuing, but we need support to make sure that attention stays strong. In particular, I draw your attention to our reference to ESEA reauthorization and the Higher Education Act reauthorization. The Elementary Secondary Education Act, there certainly has been quite a bit of talk in this new Congress that there are activities and movement, and it's something that is going to require immediate and sustained attention to ensure that that these education provisions, that these education law changes are really have components speaking to what foster youth need to be educationally successful. Key to that is going to have to hear a consistent voice and a consistent emphasis on these issues to make sure that these changes continue to represent this uniquely vulnerable student population. So we took a look in those 3 slides about federal policy, and now we just wanted to highlight a few things for you about what's going on at the state and local level. And similar to the federal level, we see some great progress or momentum happening at the state. In addition to things like Maura just highlighted, the state studies that came out of California, we see folks, states and local jurisdictions focusing more and more on data, we definitely have been seeing some trends of what kind of things states have been requesting and needing now that the awareness building has taken place. The awareness is there. Now it's time for action, and there are many states and local jurisdictions that are taking action in this issue, but they really need help in order to shape those efforts and make them efficient and make them successful to really lead to better educational outcomes for kids. So some of the most frequent things we're seeing, we thought it'd be important to highlight. A lot of times what jurisdictions are requesting help with is help us identify what are our key goals and priorities. Often we're using that blueprint framework as a starting point for their conversations, but really using it to say which of these goals are your goals in this state, in that locality, and which are the priorities here, what's working well here, where are your gaps, and ultimately, what are the recommendations to move forward. Convening folks across systems is the other biggest request that we get from jurisdictions. Help us get the right players to the table and potentially even come and be that third-party voice to help talk about these issues in a way that isn't finger-pointing across systems, but is really saying we're going to roll up our sleeves and work collaboratively to make change. The data collection and information sharing, so much help that states need in breaking down their individual data silos and barriers to try to integrate data, to really address the trust and confidentiality issues and relationship issues, as well as the legal components to data sharing and information sharing. Court practices, we certainly, Juvenile Law Center, the ABA, and Education Law has talked a lot about how the court's role and the court advocacy can really help to focus attention and to improve education outcomes for kids. And then looking closer at state law and local policies, and really trying to share what's good examples of what's working around the country with other jurisdictions. I know the data still, some of the bigger picture data is still showing poor outcomes, as Maura said, but when we start focusing on some of the local initiatives that are doing some good interventions and good work, we're starting to see glimmers of hope. And finally, along with those kind of TA requests, on the next slide we can show that there are the types of tools and resources that accompany those kinds of requests. So there's a lot of jurisdictions out there who just need training, who repeatedly ask for training for their judges, training for their education partners that are newly to the table but don't know a lot about the foster care system, training for those caseworkers and advocates. Tools to really help digest some of this stuff and to make it quicker to identify what the biggest red flags in a child's educational record are, to ways to screen information and to troubleshoot when needed. Guides for educators and how to work with us and our systems, child welfare and the courts, checklists and reports. There's a lot of things where there's been models created, and that can be tweaked and shared with other jurisdictions. Certainly legally compliant data sharing agreements and MOUs, that's been a very popular request over the last several years. The next slide is really just a quick visual to give you a sense of, again, I've said it, but it bears repeating. I think we've raised awareness. I think that has been a real success around these issues. Folks are aware that education is critical for kids in care, and now it's really helping them do what needs to be done to change those outcomes. We say in our project that we've worked with virtually every state, but this was just really over the life of our project. But this map just represented, we tracked in 2014 which states requested some sort of assistance from us. And it just represents in 2014 alone, 27 states were asking for some kind of resource, support, assistance, training, which again is, I think, a powerful statement to say that there's a need for support in this area. One state I wanted to highlight for you is the state of Texas and some of their work, and I think we can go into this in more depth at another time if that helps. But I think really understanding what that means. In 2010, the Supreme Court of Texas created a children's part of their Children's Commission, created an education committee, and over the course of 2 years convened key leaders from education, child welfare, the courts, all a whole host of other stakeholders to develop what they call the Texas Blueprint, which is really their recommendations for how they wanted to change practice, policy, data, how courts' responsiveness to these issues. It was a tremendous undertaking, but what I think, what I want to emphasize with you is equally tremendous is the 2-year stint, where they have continued to sustain that momentum, where they've actually been implementing recommendation by recommendation and plugging through those. Recent statistics that I think they're going to release to the Court Commission in March is that they have 80% of the recommendations, and there were something like 200 recommendations that they put forward. 80% of them have either been completed or in the process, have active activity going on. And so they're getting ready. This is a lofty and critical recommendation blueprint, and they didn't think they were going to achieve it in 2 years, and so they're getting ready to identify phase 2 of that project. But I think just to make what I'm saying just feel very real, I think there's 2 examples I'm going to pull out because there's so many good things that have happened there. One is a change within the Texas Education Agency. This is an agency that back in 2010 was in the midst of drastic layoffs at their state agency. And over the course of these 4 years, there are probably 10 different people within Texas Education Agency that I could pick up the phone and call who really understand foster care issues. They actually have one person who is their state coordinator who's doing a lot of work, but they are really seriously committed to tracking data on these issues. They are working, and not to overemphasize TEA, DFPS, the Child Welfare State Agency, has done a complete overhaul of their education policies. They are right there with TEA, working with them. And the other significant difference, when this project was launched in 2010, they had basic baseline data that showed the poor outcomes of kids in Texas. So the whole project was data-driven based on these poor outcomes, and the whole blueprint was reflected by that. But now they have undertaken about a year's worth of process of developing and integrating through a cross-tab mechanisms. There are 2 data systems, so they're on the cusp of releasing some really powerful, improved quality data reports about how kids are doing educationally statewide, and I think that's another just huge success for them. I think I could go on and on about that, but I know we're limited on time. I think if anybody on the call is interested in learning more, we could provide that to time to others. And somebody had mentioned perhaps that you're meeting in Texas at some point. I think that there are some wonderful people, many of the leaders who are in Austin who could really talk about their work and get a sense. And we've been at their side throughout this 4-year process, and it really is a testament to great, committed people coming from all systems. So what have we learned? And this, again, pulling back a little and thinking about some big picture learnings from these years that we've been working on this project. I think one of the big messages, and I think you've heard it in my comments, is how critical interagency collaboration is. No single entity. There's a lot of work that individual agencies, that courts can do on their own to make some progress here, but it cannot be done solely on their own. And so it's the interagency collaboration for these issues that are so critical, and it's just so important that there be support to help facilitate that coordination and collaboration. It's not something that happens overnight, and the resources and support for that facilitation are really key. The data collection and information sharing, I think, since underrepresented scholars, and I just see this as being a huge wave of focus that we've got. Take a look at the states we list here. There is a growing number of states who are focused on and actually are able to report out on data for kids in care and their education, some aspects of their educational progress. We just really need to see that list get longer. But it's the data collection and it's the information sharing and being able to report on that data that really drives reforms. It's no coincidence that the states who can do that are often the states that then have the commitment and the buy-in of the leadership to really move things forward. Another big lesson that we've learned, I'm sure many of you have experienced this in your own work as well, but just making clear that when there's investment in this specific subset of students, and this particularly resonates when we're talking to our education partners, whether that be the philanthropic partners, whether it be the specific state or local education agencies or a national organization, when you invest in this subset of students and identify strategies that work for them, you're identifying strategies that can work for a lot of vulnerable students within the school building or within that education system. And so the impact that that investment can have can really resonate far beyond just children care, but really resonate with many of our most at-risk students. And even small investments can have a large impact. If you jump to the next slide, I think one of your colleagues on this, who are part of this collaborative, the Annie E. Casey Foundation, just at the end of 2014 released the Sustaining Momentum report, which I think really makes the case. Annie E. was specifically invested in the issue of school stability, and in this report it really demonstrated how their investment has made a significant impact both in the individual states that they've worked in and sort of at the national piece. And I really encourage you to take a look at that as an example there. So jumping really quickly to some trends and opportunities, sort of where are we going, where do we see the direction of these issues, and where could there be possibilities for additional investment and need. Certainly in this policy arena, we see some really important pieces. Educational stability, fostering connections, implementation has got a lot of attention since 2008. We certainly see some really, really strong signs of progress. But there is more to be done, and some of it is more nuanced. And I think some of the states that have been tackling particularly education pieces are now struggling with some of the more complex or the more nuanced components of, okay, we're keeping some kids stable, but others we're still not, and what are some of these issues related to transportation and cost, and it takes another level and another layer of collaboration, and they still need support with that. I mentioned ESEA. I think it's going to be really critical. We really need to see ESEA and higher education, I think, act both how children in foster care are going to be addressed in these education laws. I think it's a huge missed opportunity if they are not. And how do we get the attention how do we use that to get the attention of educators and education funders to really think about how critical it is to make sure their needs are being addressed. So policy is a huge area. Data, as we've talked about, I think we've mentioned the invisible achievement gap out of California, but I think it's a really great example of where, private foundation investing in a comprehensive, it was the Stewart Foundation who invested in this data report, but really had a direct impact on state funding for children in foster care. It came out at the right time when policy conversations in California were underway and was really able to impact the state dollars assisting kids in care. Data is increasingly growing, and the need for investment and support really can't be underestimated there. On the next slide, I think some other areas to just think about: education advocacy and practice. Like we said, school stability has been a focus, but there's some other really critical areas that I think have not had the same level of attention. Things like focusing on specifically on, one is the courtroom, and how courts are addressing education or not addressing education and their oversight of child welfare cases and when kids are court involved. And then there's just a level of advocacy we need to see to really have success here. It's one thing to keep a child stable in school. It's another to ensure that there's a high level of advocacy taking place on behalf of that young person to ensure that that all of their needs are being met. So issues related to special education, coordinated transition plans across education and child welfare systems, ensuring our congregate care kids and those unique educational needs, and of course trying to continue to do good advocacy so that children in who are experiencing, that we were seeing less school discipline actions taking place for kids in care, but when kids in care are experiencing those disciplinary actions, they have the advocacy necessary to minimize the impact of those actions. And then really thinking about the school base, more said, and it really resonates, that the number of hours, particularly our older youth in care, spend in school. It's a significant part of your waking hours is spent in school and with classmates and in a school environment or school activities, and really focusing in on the school climate issues. So things like creating trauma-sensitive environments within school buildings, coordinating trauma-informed practices. We certainly see growing amount of trauma-informed practice in the child welfare arena, some attention now happening for the courts, making sure that same type of attention. So schools are a place where a child who's experienced trauma is safe and able to learn. I'm going to turn it back over to Maura. I know we want to save some time for questions. To really just hit home, we've given you a lot of information. I'm talking quickly to make sure that we relay everything we want to, but certainly know that we're available for any follow-up questions, and just to let you know a little bit about our project and where to go to learn more. Maura?
Thanks, Kathy. I just wanted to mention in closing that we have a website, fostercareandeducation.org. We have a listserv of over 2,800 members from 48 states and D.C. On our website, we have training materials. We also organize conference calls to talk about specific issues such as school discipline, special education needs, etc. We have all of our webinars, fact sheets, issue briefs, model MOUs on how to support data sharing, implementation toolkit on school stability. But we also have a searchable database, which I think is really critical and important, so that you're able to look at specific laws across states with respect to issues such as school stability or credit transfer and access to a statewide diploma. We also draw down from the school district local level to look at enrollment policies for kids in foster care, ensuring kids that have mentors at the school level. In addition to those activities, we also facilitate the National Working Group on Education and Foster Care, which is comprised of 23 organizations, and we'll show you a list of some of them in a moment. And they get together, we have conference calls, we share information, work on policy agendas of what do we think are the policies that we should be looking at and trying to inform. In addition, we have an education advisory group that's part of the National Working Group, and that is composed of 18 national education organizations. All of the organizations are national in scope on both of these. But we really think that that's critically important to ensure that information that we have is shared with education associations and seeps down to the state and local level as well through that education advisory group. And as Kathy's already mentioned, we provide state and local technical assistance and support. Next slide. This just shows you what our website looks like and where the searchable database is, etc. And you'll find more information there and news and updates on, especially as guidance comes out. We provide everything as it sort of comes out at the federal level as well. Next slide. This is an example of the Google search that you can do and how you can search by topic, search by state, etc. Next slide. You're already on it. Very good. Sorry. So the next slide shows you the National Working Group on Foster Care and Education. And this does not represent all of the organizations that are part of that, but I think what you see here is underscoring the collaborative cross-systems nature of it, where you see child welfare, you see the courts, you see education, you see foundations all involved, and research groups as well. And then finally, the last slide just provides our contact information. And we really do hope that you follow up with us. We certainly welcome you to join the listserv. We welcome you to join the National Working Group if anyone is interested and wants to follow up with us. And we really greatly appreciate this opportunity to provide this information and look forward to continuing the conversation with you. And now I'm going to turn it over to Bob as moderator to see if you have any questions.
Thank you. And we have had some questions sent our way. The first from Chris Sturgis. And hi, Chris. I know we really can't talk through this medium, but it's great that you're participating on this. Chris asks about what our recommendations are for ESEA reauthorization as they relate to foster youth. And Kathy, perhaps you can field that one.
Sure, Bob. Yeah, great question. And, I think there's been a lot of work going into thinking about what are some of the ways that the Elementary Secondary Education Act can be changed to address the needs of children in foster care. Number one, and you can hear a common thread here, is data. Specifically to be able to have a state education data systems track and be required to address the specific needs of children when they're in foster care. So I think data is a really important one of the elements for consideration. The others have to do with, Fostering Connections took us quite a long way in focusing on school stability, right to remain in a school, and or immediate enrollment in a new school without typical requirements that sometimes come along with that can cause delays. And so while the federal administration has come out with some very strong and good guidance instructing districts and states to districts and state education agencies to work with child welfare to make that happen, it isn't embedded in their education law, and we really think similar language should. That is the law that education folks look to, that guide their practices, and having it as part of ESA reauthorization, I think, is quite critical. Transportation and how child welfare agencies and education agencies work together to provide as well as cover costs of transportation when a child, what's best for that child is to remain in the school, and there are some transportation costs that ensue. And so another piece to consider is really requiring states to come up with a plan for how agencies are going to work together and address transportation and share those costs, or having them identify the ways in which that collaboration is going to happen. Also, what we found so often are these points of contact within districts, even sometimes within schools, but for purposes of ESCI, within districts and within state education agencies, the idea of having someone who specifically knows about kids in care, who is partnering with state agencies and the local child welfare agency to address any of the barriers that are coming in. It's states who have that are the ones that are really starting to be able to really show some success. And then finally, thinking about another issue, when young people, it is best for them to move to new schools, they still encounter credit transfer issues and sometimes graduation barriers, because the requirements for graduation in one district are not in line with another. And so really addressing how kids who are moving through no fault of their own, how we can address credit transfers and graduation requirements to have less of an impact on our kids in care. So we can talk more if you're interested in learning more, but those are just some of the highlights.
Okay, and we have a couple of questions that I'll toss to Maura. One on how to use data in terms of how we might use both aggregate and student-specific data to gain the attention of policymakers, to evaluate interventions, and to measure progress. And once you answer that, I'll toss you another one about court practices.
Well, I think with respect to aggregate data, it's providing that, as I mentioned, we have no information in terms of the national level as to what the educational outcomes are for children in foster care. So I think disaggregating that information and seeing the status of how these children are doing. In addition, what's their trajectory? We're at a stage where we have interoperability between agencies in many instances, and we can see not only how they do in school, but did they receive what they needed to, with respect to early education, where are they with respect to access to post-secondary. So I think it's to highlight what is going on with this group, this cohort of students, and to do that at the aggregate level. In addition to that, we need to be looking at specific interventions at the local level, at the school district level, to try to provide additional remedial support. Does it make a difference? We have examples from Cincinnati, Ohio, and other places where folks have try to, look at this issue and say, what are the specific interventions we need to provide for children? And then looking at it at the student level to see, did that intervention work? Did it make a difference to provide the remedial support or to have mentors or liaisons in the school building level? So I think you need to be looking at it both at the aggregate level and at the student-specific student level data as well.
There's also a question about court practices, what positive court practices might look like, from court rules to judicial bench cards and other things that courts might be looking at. Because the courts review these cases at least every 6 months and more frequently in many jurisdictions. Maura, do you want to touch on that?
Sure. I'll give a few examples of that. California, New York, and Pennsylvania are 3 states that have adopted juvenile court rules requiring judges to look at education at every stage of the adjudicatory process. So it's embedded in their court rules that they need to be asking questions about education. And I can speak within Pennsylvania that it's made an enormous difference because judges are looking at it. Child welfare managers are also looking at this issue. Attorneys are looking at this issue. We've had an explosion of calls, I know, for us at the state level in Pennsylvania from attorneys and judges, et cetera, because they're looking at, is this child going to school? Are they making progress towards graduation? What are the issues? So I think that's critically important. Another issue that's come up in those states and as well as others is ensuring that every child in both the dependency system and delinquency system in Pennsylvania have some kind of education decision maker, someone who is active and involved and paying attention to the child's education trajectory. So that would be the person that would be the special education decision maker for the child, or who is there to advocate for the child in the school discipline process. And again, embedding that into the juvenile, into a court rule makes a significant impact on the lives of children. So those are some examples.
Okay, thanks. And Kathy, there's a question regarding technical assistance and training. And do you have recommendations for what states need in that area?
Yeah, so I think what we tried to do in the presentation is just highlight some of the examples of the types of things that states need. Similar to, we talk about individual kids, I think when there has to be a bit of an individualized assessment for the state or the local collaborative, whoever it is that's sort of asking for help in terms of identifying, what's working, what are their strengths as it comes to related to education, where the gaps are, what isn't happening. And often what we do is use that blueprint framework as our tool to guide their conversations. And to say, which pieces of these are working here. Maybe they're doing a great job of school stability, but nobody has really thought about or looked at, the advocacy and the appointment of decision makers for their special ed kids. And by the way, their data is now revealing that 60% of the kids in care in their jurisdiction need special ed. So it's really about taking a close look of if you have data, what is it showing about this population of kids, identifying your strengths, identifying the gaps, and then really working cross-system. So what can everybody work, roll up their sleeves together and say, these are going to be the priority areas for us in the next, 6 months, year, in terms of here's what we're going to work on, and here's what the courts can do, and here's what the education system's going to do, and here's what child welfare agency's going to do, and here's what we're going to do with our parent community and family engagement, and here's what we're going to do with our youth themselves, and here's what we're going to do with our foster parents, and really have it be sort of a holistic approach to what's needed.
Okay, thank you. I see we're beginning to lose some folks, and I always think it's better to end early than hold you late. So we're always happy to answer questions, and we've left our contact information on the screen for you. Barbara will send you this PowerPoint so you can make it available to members of the Youth Transition Group and those who participated on the webinar. And thank you for your time, attention, and questions this afternoon. We look forward to staying in touch. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.